The October air hung heavy with the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke as Eleanor stepped onto the porch of her small apartment. She had almost forgotten about the chill of autumn, absorbed as she was in her daily routine, but tonight was different. There, resting on her doormat, was a black envelope with her name written in crimson ink. There was no return address, no stamp, just a single word: Eleanor. She hesitated for a moment before picking it up, her fingers tracing the rough texture of the envelope. A shiver ran down her spine, a premonition she couldn't quite place. She had lived in Wychwood long enough to know when something felt off, and this did. The town had a way of creeping under your skin, its dark history clinging to every corner and shadow. Still, curiosity got the better of her, and she tore it open. Inside was a simple card, the kind you'd find at a high-end event, embossed and elegant. The text, also in crimson, read, "The ultimate Halloween horror story. Experience. Featuring real-life haunted locations. You are invited to a night of terror and thrills, a journey into the darkest corners of Wychwood's history. Join us at the Alden Estate at 8 p.m. on October 31st. Fear awaits those who dare to enter. Victor Blackwood." A smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. She had heard about the Alden Estate all her life. Stories whispered at bonfires, legends passed down through generations. It was said that no one had lived there for over 100 years, not since the Alden family vanished without a trace on Halloween night. And now, the estate was opening its doors. It felt too good, or perhaps too ominous, to be true. The card fluttered in her hand as she read the last line, printed in smaller, italicized letters. "Not everyone who enters will leave the same." Eleanor's pulse quickened. It was absurd, the kind of marketing gimmick that would draw crowds from miles around, but the way the words looked, scrawled almost carelessly, it felt like a dare. She quickly texted her friends, and within minutes her phone buzzed with responses. They were all in. James, always eager for a thrill; Maya, who loved anything that might scare her; Ryan, who was skeptical but game; and Grace, who usually stayed far from anything remotely eerie but seemed strangely intrigued this time. By evening, they were gathered at Eleanor's place, the invitation lying on the coffee table like a black omen. "So, this is happening?" Ryan said, running a hand through his hair. "You seriously think this isn't some kind of weird joke?" "Of course it is," James replied, grinning. "But that's the fun part. It's Halloween, for crying out loud. When else are we gonna get the chance to explore a haunted mansion?" "You know," Grace started, her voice softer than usual, "the Alden Estate isn't just some cheesy attraction. People have gone there and never come back." Maya rolled her eyes. "That's just a story to scare kids. Nobody's been there in years. We're probably the first in forever." Eleanor watched them, the conversation washing over her as she studied their faces. There was an edge to their excitement, a hint of something nervous and unsure. She could see the doubt flickering behind their bravado, and she felt it too. But it was Halloween, and if there was ever a time to indulge in a bit of terror, this was it. "We'll be fine," she said, trying to reassure them, or maybe herself. "Besides, it's a group thing, right? We'll stick together, and if it's too creepy, we can always bail." "I'm bringing a flashlight," Maya said, laughing, though her eyes didn't quite match her tone. "And maybe some holy water just in case." They agreed to meet at Eleanor's the next night, and as they left, Eleanor found herself alone with the invitation once more. She picked it up, her thumb tracing over Victor Blackwood's name. She didn't know the man, had never even heard of him before tonight, but she felt a strange pull, a connection she couldn't explain. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind refused to quiet. Her thoughts kept circling back to the estate, to the stories she'd heard growing up. There was one in particular that she couldn't shake, about a girl who had seen lights in the windows of the Alden Estate late at night. She had told everyone she could see people dancing inside, though the mansion had been empty for years. No one believed her, of course, and a week later she disappeared. They found her diary a month later, washed up on the riverbank. The last entry was only 2 words. "He's watching." Eleanor jolted awake, her skin clammy with sweat. She reached for her phone, squinting at the bright screen. It was 3:33 a.m. An unsettling thought drifted through her mind. She hadn't noticed before, but the invitation had no RSVP, no phone number to call, no website to visit. It was as if Victor Blackwood had simply known they would come. She almost texted her friends to cancel, but something stopped her. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was that same inexplicable pull she had felt earlier. Whatever it was, it kept her fingers hovering over the screen, hesitating. The next day, the town seemed different. Wychwood had always been quaint, with its cobblestone streets and old Victorian houses, but today it felt hollow, like an empty stage waiting for a play to begin. Decorations hung from windows, jack-o'-lanterns grinned from porches, but there was no warmth, no laughter. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the crunch of leaves beneath Eleanor's boots as she walked to the meeting spot. As evening approached, she met up with the others, and they piled into Ryan's car, driving out of town towards the estate. The sun dipped low, casting long, twisted shadows across the road, and an unnatural fog began to roll in, thick and heavy. It was almost as if the world was closing in around them, guiding them, funneling them towards the estate. No one spoke much during the drive, each lost in their own thoughts, eyes flicking nervously to the trees that lined the road. The road to the Alden Estate seemed to stretch forever, a serpentine path that twisted and turned through the dense woods, leading them deeper into the heart of darkness. The fog had grown thicker, swirling around them like ghostly hands, and the headlights of Ryan's car barely pierced through it. It was as if the world outside had dissolved, leaving only this narrow, winding road. The car was filled with a nervous, buzzing silence. James was tapping his fingers against the window, his leg bouncing restlessly. Maya stared straight ahead, her eyes unblinking, as if trying to see beyond the fog. Grace fidgeted with the silver cross around her neck, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Ryan kept his focus on the road, his jaw clenched, while Eleanor gripped the invitation tightly, her knuckles white. "Are we sure about this?" Grace finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, it's not too late to turn back." "Oh, come on, Grace," James said, forcing a laugh. "It's just an old house. We're gonna tell ghost stories, get scared, and then laugh about it later. That's the point, right?" "It's more than just a house," Maya muttered, but she didn't elaborate. No one asked her to. They were all feeling it, the oppressive weight of the fog, the suffocating quiet of the woods. As they neared the estate, even the usual sounds of the forest had disappeared, leaving only the hum of the engine and the faint rustle of leaves. Finally, the estate loomed into view, a dark, monolithic structure that seemed to rise out of the fog, its jagged edges cutting into the night sky. The mansion was enormous, a relic of a bygone era, with its grand Gothic architecture now decaying and overgrown. Twisted ivy snaked up the walls, and the windows, dark and lifeless, looked like hollow eyes staring down at them. The front gate, wrought iron and rusted, stood slightly ajar, creaking softly as the wind pushed it back and forth. Ryan parked the car and they stepped out, the gravel crunching under their feet. For a moment, no one moved. They just stood there, staring up at the estate, dwarfed by its sheer size and presence. I thought it was supposed to be abandoned," Grace said, her voice shaking. "Why are there lights on?" Eleanor's gaze followed Grace's, and she saw it too, a faint, flickering glow in the upper windows, as if someone was moving from room to room, carrying a candle. She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, a figure stepped out of the shadows near the front door. Victor Blackwood. He was dressed in a dark, tailored suit that seemed out of place, as if he had stepped out of another time. His smile was polite but cold, and his eyes glinted in the dim light, almost like a predator's. He raised a hand in greeting, and Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "I'm glad you could all make it. I trust you had a pleasant journey." "Yeah, sure," Ryan said, forcing a smile. "So how does this work? Are we like touring the house or—" Blackwood's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "All in due time. But first, a few rules. The Alden Estate is special, shall we say. It's important that you stick together. Do not wander off. And if you hear something, anything calling to you, ignore it. The night is long, and the estate has a way of making you see things that aren't really there." "Wait, what do you mean?" Maya asked, her voice sharp. "See things, like hallucinations." Blackwood's eyes flicked to her, and for a moment his smile faltered. "Something like that, but I assure you it's all part of the experience. Now, shall we?" He turned and pushed open the heavy, creaking front door, gesturing for them to follow. They hesitated, but curiosity and a strange, unspoken compulsion drove them forward. The entrance hall was grand but faded, its former glory hidden beneath layers of dust and neglect. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something sweet and metallic, like the faint trace of blood. Ornate chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their crystals dull and grimy, and an old, tattered red carpet led deeper into the house. Eleanor glanced around, her eyes drawn to the portraits that lined the walls. Each one depicted a member of the Alden family, dressed in finery, their expressions stern and cold. But as she passed one, she could have sworn she saw the woman's eyes shift, just a fraction, following her movement. She blinked and looked again, but the eyes were still, gazing out into the distance. They followed Blackwood down a narrow corridor, the floorboards creaking under their feet. He led them into a large room, dimly lit by a single flickering chandelier. The room was filled with old furniture, draped in white sheets, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper that might once have been a vibrant red. In the center of the room stood a grand piano, its keys yellowed with age, and next to it, a large wooden table covered in dust. "This is the ballroom," Blackwood said, his voice echoing slightly. "Many years ago, the Aldens hosted grand parties here. People from all over the town would come, dressed in their finest, to dance and drink and forget their troubles. But that all ended on Halloween night, over a century ago. That was the last time anyone saw the Alden family alive. "What happened to them?" James asked, his voice barely hiding his excitement. Blackwood's smile returned, but there was no warmth in it. "No one knows. They say that at the stroke of midnight, the music stopped and the lights went out. When the townspeople came the next morning, the estate was empty. No bodies, no signs of a struggle, just silence." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But some say you can still hear the music, faintly, if you listen closely enough." Eleanor's skin prickled, and she glanced around the room, half expecting to hear a ghostly waltz echo through the walls. But there was only silence, thick and suffocating. "Okay, this is all very spooky and cool," Ryan said, trying to break the tension. "But what's next? We just wander around?" "Not wander," Blackwood corrected, his eyes narrowing. "Explore. There are many rooms in this estate, each with its own story, its own secrets. But remember what I said. Stick together, and if you hear something, do not follow it." He handed them each a small, old-fashioned lantern, the kind you'd see in a period drama, and motioned to the staircase. "You will begin upstairs. The real experience starts when you reach the top." As they ascended the grand, sweeping staircase, the atmosphere grew heavier, the air colder. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not by Blackwood, but by something else, something lurking just beyond the edges of the lantern's dim light. She glanced back at the portraits, but they were all still. Still, she couldn't get the image out of her head. The eyes moving, shifting, watching. When they reached the top, Blackwood stood at the foot of the stairs, looking up at them, his face shrouded in shadow. "Good luck," he said softly, almost as if to himself. "I'll be waiting for you." At the end. The words sent a chill through Eleanor's bones. She didn't understand why, but she felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run, to leave this place and never come back. But when she looked at her friends, she saw that same strange compulsion she had felt earlier, the pull that had brought them here, reflected in their eyes. They were in this now, and there was no turning back. As they moved deeper into the house, the fog outside thickened, pressing against the windows like a living thing. The lanterns cast long, twisted shadows across the walls, and Eleanor thought she saw shapes moving in the darkness, just out of sight. She wanted to say something, to tell the others, but her throat felt tight, her voice trapped. The first door they came to was slightly ajar, and when James pushed it open, they found themselves in a bedroom. The air inside stale and cold. The bed was neatly made, as if waiting for someone to return, and on the nightstand was an old, dusty photograph. Eleanor picked it up and brushed the dust away, revealing the image of a young woman smiling shyly at the camera. She was holding a small, delicate locket in her hands. As Eleanor studied the photo, she felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if she had seen the woman before, but she couldn't place where. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw the reflection in the mirror above the dresser, not of her, but of the woman in the photograph, standing just behind her, her eyes wide and terrified. Eleanor gasped and spun around, but there was no one there, just the cold, empty room, and the faint echo of Blackwood's words in her mind. "If you hear something, do not follow it." She took a step back, her heart pounding, and when she looked down, she saw the locket from the photograph lying on the floor, as if someone had placed it there just for her to find. And then, somewhere far below, she heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound of a piano playing a slow, mournful waltz. The group moved through the dimly lit hallways of the Alden Estate, their lanterns casting eerie, dancing shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The farther they ventured, the more it felt like the house was breathing around them, shifting subtly, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Doors creaked open just enough to invite a peek inside, and the air was heavy with an ancient, musty scent, mingled with something far less familiar, a sweet, metallic tang that set their nerves on edge. "Do you guys hear that?" Maya whispered, stopping in her tracks. Her voice seemed to disappear, swallowed up by the oppressive silence that clung to the house. For a moment there was nothing but the faint flicker of their lanterns. Then, as if answering Maya's question, a sound echoed down the hallway, a low, rhythmic thumping like a heartbeat reverberating through the walls. Eleanor's stomach twisted as she realized it wasn't coming from any of the rooms. It was coming from below. "The basement?" Ryan said, his voice tight. "You've got to be kidding me. There's no way I'm going down there." "It's probably just some old pipes or something," James said, trying to keep his tone light, but the edge of fear betrayed him. "Let's just keep moving. We haven't even explored the main rooms yet." "We're not alone in here," Grace murmured, almost to herself. "I can feel it." The others shot her a glance, but no one dared to agree. The truth was, they all felt it, the sensation of being watched, the subtle pull of something unseen guiding them deeper into the estate. Eleanor tightened her grip on the lantern's handle, trying to shake off the creeping dread. They followed the hallway to a set of large double doors, intricately carved with symbols that none of them recognized. Eleanor hesitated, tracing one of the carvings with her finger. It was a series of interlocking circles, with jagged lines radiating outward. Something about the design made her uneasy, but she couldn't explain why. "What is this place?" Maya asked, her voice barely a whisper. James shrugged, pushing the door open. Only one way to find out. The room they entered was vast and empty, the ceiling arching high above them like the belly of a beast. At the far end stood a large stone altar, covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. The floor was lined with the same strange symbols they had seen on the door, arranged in a sprawling, intricate pattern that covered every inch of the stone. Eleanor's lantern flickered, casting a brief, ghostly light over the room, and for a split second she thought she saw something move in the shadows near the altar. "Nope, I'm out," Ryan said, turning back toward the door, but it was too late. The heavy doors swung shut behind them with a loud, echoing boom, and the room was plunged into near darkness. "What the hell?" Ryan ran to the door, yanking at the handles, but it wouldn't budge. "Who did that?" "No one did," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "It closed on its own." The group was silent, the reality of their situation settling in, trapped, sealed inside a room that felt more like a tomb. Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the altar. There was something there, half buried under a layer of dust, a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and brittle. She picked it up, blowing off the dust to reveal the title etched into the cover. The Binding Rite. Grace's face went pale. No, this can't be real." "What is it?" Maya asked, her voice trembling. "You know something about this?" Grace's eyes darted to the symbols on the floor, then back to the book. "I've seen this before. My grandmother, she used to tell stories about the Alden family, about how they weren't just a family, but a kind of cult. She said they practiced old, forbidden rituals, rituals that bound spirits, trapping them in objects or places." James laughed nervously, but there was no humor in it. "You're saying this is some kind of, what, spell book?" "I don't know," Grace whispered, clutching her cross tightly. "But I think we're standing inside one of their rituals right now." As if on cue, the rhythmic thumping returned, louder this time, like a drumbeat echoing up from the floor. The symbols on the ground began to glow, a faint red light pulsing in time with the sound. Eleanor's heart pounded as she flipped through the book's pages, her eyes scanning the text. The language was archaic, but she could make out enough to understand what she was reading. "It's not a spell book," she said, her voice hollow. "It's a guide for a ritual that binds a spirit, keeps it from escaping." Maya's face twisted with confusion. "Why would anyone want to do that?" "To control it," Grace said, her voice barely audible. "To use its power." Eleanor's breath hitched as she read further. "But it only works if there's a sacrifice. Someone has to give up their soul to anchor the spirit." She looked up, her eyes wide with horror. They weren't just trapping a spirit, they were feeding it. Before anyone could respond, the lanterns flickered again, and the room was suddenly filled with a blinding, searing light. The air grew frigid, and a sharp, metallic smell flooded their senses. Eleanor's vision blurred, and she saw them. Figures standing around the altar, their faces obscured by hoods, their hands outstretched, chanting in a low, guttural tone. She blinked, and the figures were gone, but the chanting continued, echoing through the room. "What's happening?" Ryan shouted, his voice cracking. "What are we supposed to do?" Blackwood's voice drifted through the darkness, as smooth and cold as ice. "You're doing exactly what you need to." They spun around, but he wasn't there. His voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating off the walls. "You see, this ritual isn't just about binding, it's about awakening. The Aldens thought they could control the spirit they summoned, but they failed. The ritual was left unfinished, and the spirit has been waiting for someone to come along and finish what they started." "No," Eleanor whispered, her hands trembling. "You're lying. You're trying to scare us." "Oh, I'm not trying, Eleanor. I'm succeeding." Blackwood's voice seemed to seep into her mind, slipping past her defenses, wrapping around her thoughts like a serpent. "Each of you was chosen for a reason. You all brought your own fears, your own demons, and now you're going to offer them up as the final piece of the ritual." The light intensified, and the symbols on the floor blazed bright red. Eleanor could barely breathe, the pressure building in her chest, as if something was squeezing the air out of her lungs. She looked around at her friends and saw the terror mirrored on their faces. James was pale, his eyes wide and unseeing, while Maya clutched her head, trying to block out the chanting. Ryan was muttering to himself, his lips moving frantically, as if praying. Then she saw Grace. Her friend stood motionless, her eyes blank, and for a moment Eleanor thought she saw a flicker of something behind them, something dark and ancient, like a shadow moving just beneath the surface. "Oh, Grace?" Eleanor reached out, but Grace stepped back, Her face twisted into a strange, unnerving smile. "It's too late," Grace said, her voice distorted, as if layered with another, deeper tone. "You can't stop it. It's already begun." The room trembled and the walls seemed to pulse, the symbols glowing brighter, burning like brands. Eleanor's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The book, the ritual. There had to be a way to stop it. She flipped through the pages, frantically searching for anything that could reverse the process. But the text was becoming harder to read, the words blurring together. Suddenly, the book was ripped from her hands, floating in mid-air, the pages turning on their own. It settled on a page near the end, and Eleanor's eyes widened as she read the final instruction. To sever the bond, the offering must reclaim the power, and the cycle must be broken. "What does that mean?" Maya screamed, tears streaming down her face. "What are we supposed to do?" But before Eleanor could respond, the room was filled with a deafening roar, and the floor beneath them cracked, splitting open to reveal a gaping void. From the darkness below, a twisted, shadowy form began to rise, its shape shifting, its eyes burning like embers. "It means," Blackwood said, his voice echoing through the chaos, "that one of you has to make a choice. Bind the spirit, or take its place." The twisted form lashed out, and Eleanor felt a searing pain in her chest, as if something was being ripped out of her. She gasped, falling to her knees, but she clung to the last shreds of her strength, forcing herself to look up. The others were fighting too, struggling against the unseen force that tried to pull them down, but she could see it in their eyes. They were losing. She realized then with a sickening certainty that this was what Blackwood had planned all along. He had brought them here to finish what the Aldens had started, to complete the ritual and unleash the spirit once more. And unless they could find a way to stop it, they would all be consumed. Eleanor closed her eyes, steeling herself, and whispered the words from the book's final page. "I reclaim the power, and I break the cycle." As the words left her lips, the room exploded in a blinding light, and everything went silent. Eleanor's voice echoed through the chamber, the words hanging in the air like a spell. For a moment, everything was still. The room was filled with a bright, searing light, and the shadows that had been creeping at the edges retreated, shrinking away from the brilliance. The twisted, formless creature hovering over the altar shrieked, its wail vibrating through Eleanor's bones, and she felt the air crackle with energy, as if the very fabric of the estate was being torn apart. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light flickered and dimmed, leaving only the faint, ghostly glow of their lanterns. The room was eerily quiet, the silence so thick it pressed against her ears, drowning out even her own heartbeat. Eleanor opened her eyes, expecting to see the monster vanquished, the nightmare over. But it wasn't. The dark, spectral form was still there, hovering just above the altar, its shape no longer twisted and wild, but coalescing into something more human. She could make out a face now, gaunt and pale, with hollow eyes that glowed like embers. It was smiling at her, a slow, terrible smile that made her stomach twist. "You thought you could break the cycle," it whispered, the voice echoing through the room, layered with Blackwoods and something else, something ancient. "But you don't even know what you've set free." The ground beneath Eleanor trembled, and cracks splintered across the floor, snaking out from the altar like black veins. The glowing symbols that had once been a dull red were now pulsing with a sickly green light, throbbing in time with the creature's words. It was as if the estate itself was alive, its very walls breathing in rhythm with the dark presence before them. Ryan, Maya, James, and Grace stood frozen, their faces masks of terror and confusion. They had no idea what was happening. None of them did. But Eleanor felt it deep down, a dawning realization that sent a wave of cold dread through her veins. The ritual had been completed, but not as they had thought. Instead of binding the spirit, she had released it. "No," she said, shaking her head, her voice breaking. "I broke the cycle. I read the words. It should have..." "Should have what?" The creature interrupted, its voice mocking. "Destroyed me? Sealed me away forever? You don't understand, do you? The cycle was never about containing me. It was about keeping me here, keeping me in this place, in this house. And now, thanks to you, I am free to go wherever I please." The reality of it struck her like a blow. She had been so desperate to end it, to save herself and her friends, that she hadn't understood what she was doing. Wychwood had manipulated them, led them to believe that the ritual would save them, when in truth, it had been a trap all along, a way to unleash something far more powerful than any of them had realized. The creature, no longer just a shadow, but a man-shaped figure with dark, smoldering eyes and a grin that was all teeth, took a step forward, and Eleanor instinctively stumbled back, her legs weak. "I don't want this," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I was trying to stop it." "Of course you were," it said, tilting its head almost sympathetically. "But intentions mean nothing to a creature like me. I have been waiting for centuries, Eleanor. Waiting for someone to make the wrong choice, to open the door that could never be shut again. And you, my dear, have given me that gift." The air was growing colder, and the fog that had been lurking outside the estate now seeped through the cracks, curling around their feet like a living thing. Eleanor could barely see her friends through the mist, their faces blurred and distant, as if they were already fading away. "No," she said again, more forcefully this time. "We're not finished yet." She turned to the others, but they weren't looking at her. They were staring at Grace, who stood at the center of the room, her hands outstretched, her eyes glassy and unfocused. The smile on her lips was a perfect mirror of the creature's grin, and when she spoke, it wasn't her voice that came out, but Wychwood's. "The ritual needs an anchor," she said, her head tilting slightly. "A soul to bind it, a vessel to carry it. You thought you could just say a few words and be done with it. You're more naive than I thought." Eleanor's heart sank. Grace had been the weak point, the one Wychwood had gotten to, the one he had twisted and broken. She had been the key all along, and they hadn't seen it until now. "It's me," Grace said, her voice soft, almost childlike. "I'm the anchor. I always was." And with those words, the room shifted, the walls warping and stretching, as if the estate was being swallowed whole. The dark presence moved toward Grace, its form melding with hers, and Eleanor felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She wanted to run, to scream, but her legs wouldn't move. She could only watch as the creature's shadow enveloped Grace, wrapping around her like a cloak, until there was nothing left of her but the faint outline of a girl trapped inside. "You see, Eleanor," Wychwood's voice crooned. I never intended to stay in Wychwood forever, but I needed someone to finish what the Aldens could not. A new host, a new vessel, and now, a new beginning. Eleanor's mind raced, searching for something, anything that could change what was happening, but there was nothing left to do. She had followed the path Blackwood had set out for her, step by step, without even realizing it. And now the spirit was free, and they were trapped in a house that no longer obeyed the rules of the world they knew. Maya's scream broke the silence, a raw, guttural sound that echoed off the stone walls. She lunged forward, trying to pull Grace back, but the fog thickened, pushing her away, suffocating her cries. "Stop!" Eleanor shouted, her voice cracking. "Please, just stop." "It's too late," Blackwood whispered, his voice calm and final. "You can't undo what's already been set in motion. But don't worry, Eleanor. I'll make sure Wychwood remembers you. You will be a legend, just like the Aldens, the ones who set me free." The fog swirled, tightening around Eleanor, and she felt her vision blur, her consciousness slipping. She fought to stay awake, to cling to the last remnants of hope, but it was no use. She could see the others fading, their faces dissolving into the mist, and the estate around them shifting, changing, as if it was preparing to close itself off from the world once more. But just as she felt herself slipping away, she heard a voice, faint, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. "Eleanor." It was Grace, the real Grace, fighting through the darkness, her voice trembling but defiant. "Help me. I don't want to be alone." Eleanor's heart clenched and she forced herself to move, pushing against the fog, clawing her way toward the altar. She could barely see, barely breathe, but she kept moving, driven by a single thought. She would not let Grace face this alone. "Let her go," she shouted, her voice hoarse. "Take me instead." For a moment, everything froze. The fog, the shadows, the creature, all of it seemed to pause, as if considering her offer. Then the darkness around Grace began to shift, unraveling, and Eleanor saw her friend's face, pale and tear-streaked, staring back at her. "Don't," Grace whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't do this. You don't know what it means." "I don't care," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I won't leave you." The creature's laugh echoed through the room, low and resonant. How touching. But sacrifices are not made out of love. They are made out of fear, and that is why you will fail. The fog closed in, and Eleanor felt the darkness wash over her, pulling her under, dragging her down into a cold, endless abyss. She reached out, her fingers brushing against Grace's hand, and for a moment she thought she felt warmth, the faintest touch of something real. But then the darkness swallowed them both, and there was nothing but silence. When Eleanor opened her eyes, she was standing outside the estate, the fog gone, the night clear and cold. The house loomed behind her, dark and silent, its windows blank and empty. She looked around, searching for the others, but there was no one. Just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant toll of a church bell ringing in the hour. She glanced down at her hands, half expecting to see them stained with blood, but they were clean. There was no sign of the struggle, no sign of the ritual, nothing to suggest that any of it had happened at all, except for the black envelope lying at her feet. She picked it up, her hands trembling, and opened it. Inside was a single card, identical to the one that had brought them here, but the words had changed. The ultimate Halloween horror story experience. Thank you for completing the ritual. The cycle begins anew. V. Blackwood. Eleanor's heart froze, and she looked up at the estate, its dark silhouette towering against the sky. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing at the window, watching her, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. She blinked and it was gone, but she could still feel its presence like a whisper in the back of her mind, taunting her, reminding her that this was far from over. She had broken the cycle, but not in the way she had intended. The spirit was free, and Wychwood would never be the same. But as she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of something flickering in the fog, a faint, ghostly light, like a lantern guiding the way. She hesitated, then took a step forward, following the light, not knowing where it would lead, but unable to resist. She had been pulled into the darkness, and now she was part of it. The fog swirled around her, and the last thing she heard before it swallowed her completely was the faint, haunting sound of a piano playing a slow, mournful waltz echoing through the night. And then there was only silence,